I would like to introduce and welcome our panel of leaders, and I'll do it in alphabetical order. Professor Max Bergmann is Chair of Social Transitions Research at the University of Basel, Research Councillor of the Swiss National Science Foundation, and member of the Ugandan National Academy of Sciences, and the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, a global initiative for the United Nations. He is President of the Swiss Academic Society for Environmental Research and Ecology, Section Editor of the Section Editor-in-Chief of Sustainability and Editor-in-Chief of World. Thank you, Max. Now, Professor Tawana Koop, the Vice-Chancellor and Principal of the University of Pretoria. Before joining the University of Pretoria in January last year, Professor Koop was Vice Principal of the University of the Witwatersrand. He also served as Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Advancement, Human Resources and Transformation, and between 2013 and 2014, he was Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Finance and Operations. From 2007 to 2012, he was Executive Dean of the WITS Faculty of Humanities, and also served as the head of the WITS School of Literature and Language Studies. He completed his tertiary studies in Zimbabwe and Norway. Dr. Joanna Newman is Chief Executive and Secretary General of the Association of Commonwealth Universities. So the Association of Commonwealth Universities is the world's biggest international university alliance with over 500 member institutions in over 50 countries. Joanna began as Chief Exec in April 2017 and is also a Senior Research Fellow in the History Faculty of King's College London. Before taking up her current role, she served as Vice Principal International of King's College London and was Director of the UK Higher Education International Unit and Head of Higher Education at the British Library. Professor Funmi Olonisakin is Vice President and Vice Principal of King's College London. And she's also a Professor of Security, Leadership and Development at King's. Previous roles have included Founding Director of the African Leadership Centre, which aims to build the next generation of African scholars and analysts generating cutting-edge knowledge for security and development in Africa. And she was also the Director of Conflict, Security and Development Research Group at King's. And prior to this, she worked in the Office of the UN as the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict. And our final speaker is Dr. Aldo Strobel, Executive Director of Strategic Partnerships for the National Research Foundation of South Africa. So Dr. Strobel is also a visiting fellow at the Institute for African Development at Cornell University. The internationalization of higher education and research and innovation management are his areas of expertise. He's also a scholar in sustainable agriculture, and he obtained a master's in international agricultural development in Belgium, a PhD in the US, and carried out postdoctoral research in the Netherlands. And he's a founding member of the South African Young Academy of Science and a foreign fellow of the Ugandan National Academy of Sciences. So I'm genuinely honored to hear now from our 5 superb leaders. The process is we'll have a conversation between us for around the next 50 minutes, and then we'll take your questions via the Q&A function in Zoom. And I'm just going to bring all of our leaders into the discussion by unmuting them. And I'd like to begin, please, by asking the Vice-Chancellor of TIPS for his current view as leader of one of Africa's most significant research universities on the greatest challenge that the pandemic poses towards the African higher education sector, and if he thinks there are any challenges that are more specific to the African sector compared to other international regions. So, Anna, what are your thoughts?
No, essentially, I think that in relation to teaching and learning and even research, the most direct threat and which has come to a stop right now is that we can't do any contact teaching. And so we're trying to move everything onto online and virtual platforms similar to these ones. Now, as you know, on the African continent, there are huge inequalities across the nations of Africa and also within the nations of Africa, including South Africa. So right now, what's happening on the ground is that we're trying to move teaching, learning, some degree of research and interaction that is typical of an academic institution online. So the infrastructure necessary is being put into place. We are working with telecommunications companies to zero-rate data for specific areas for teaching and learning. But also we're trying to find out how we reimagine. It's a great opportunity for us to practice what we have always been talking about all along, a transdisciplinary knowledge project. Because the coronavirus and COVID-19 demonstrates to us that no single discipline can actually address this particular challenge. At the forefront, of course, it's a medical challenge. We need to find a vaccine. We need to cure people who who are sick and also make sure they come back to health, stop infections and so on. The social inequalities, the economic inequalities, and also some of the political decision-making in all of the sectors of society are beginning to show their particular kinds of weaknesses. Weak health infrastructure, economies that are almost on their knees, and also lack of social infrastructure, housing, and all of that breeds or that are conducive to spreading infections.
Thank you very much for your view there, Professor Koop. And moving to Professor Bergman, in your opinion, what is the biggest potential disruption to research in Africa caused by the COVID-19 pandemic? Do you think this will set back research in areas that are otherwise unrelated to the virus?
Well, I think most predictions that we are making are likely to be wrong, and on the other hand, hardly anything will remain the same. I think there was a Guardian opinion piece that introduced the ideas that we're going to look back at this time and we're going to think of it as BC and AC, as before Corona and after Corona. So in many ways, I think we are in many ways, as not only as researchers, but also as research and teaching institutions and as nations, somehow it'll put us in front of a fork in the road. So the questions that you asked actually implies the potential negatives. And of course, there are many potential positives that can come from this, not necessarily from an economic perspective, but for researchers in the medium run, there are many other aspects. Also, we're likely to have a very large increase in older students. There are opportunities for upskilling, for change in career paths, for a tremendous increase in access of international resource and knowledge base, also for African scholars and institutions. So this discussion could also, and maybe at a later stage, also talk about the positives, but the question was more about the threats. So I think the most obvious one that was also mentioned just now is about defunding. And many people will consider high-level research, excellent research, as something that is currently not affordable. And I have a feeling that this will disproportionately affect also, I'm only talking about research right now, disproportionately affect institutions that are considered excellent from a research perspective. Also, I think the natural sciences and to some extent the humanities will be affected by defunding. I think also funding, we will see a lot more funding with an agenda, funding as opportunism, in the sense that, of course, on the one hand, it is very likely that many countries, not only on the African continent, but beyond, are going to invest much more on public health and health research related issues. But we'll also very likely to see religious organizations, philanthropists, endowments, pro-government ideologies to have an increasing role and voice in the research agendas. I believe that also we see an expansion of private, for-profit teaching universities that are going to offer their services, which are likely to become more because of maybe an international label and affordability, that they're going to compete more and more with conventional universities. We'll see, I think, also a kind of a psychologization of research measures and research policies. We know that ultimately on the higher level, and Aldo, I'd be very interested to see whether you agree or not, but in many ways, on the highest level of research funding, it is also a political agenda. And so in many ways, politics can and does have an influence of what gets funded. And we will see to what extent maybe populist influences on the one hand, or seeming to do the right thing in front of citizens, will have a very strong influence as what should be funded, what should not be funded. We will probably see a lot of a loss of top researchers and research group, either through migration or through dissolution. A lot more research on a lot more funding for applied research. There will be a lot of debate on Eurocentric or Western-centric versus Afrocentric research. There will be a lot of band-aid approaches in the sense that political decision makers will try to catch up with first public health, then maybe researching transmittable diseases, then maybe fund research that is more government friendly toward economic rebuilding.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I see quite a lot of different consequences.
Well, I hope that we've got a chance to discuss some of those over the next later part of this forum. Dr. Joanna Newman, how is the pandemic affecting the work and programs of the ACU in Africa and the relationships that you forge across the Commonwealth?
I was reflecting on this and remembering that I joined the ACU 3 years ago, and at that time, borders were closing, walls were being built, inhumanity was building and intolerance was building, particularly on social networks. And it's almost like we've seen a reverse, in the sense that social networks are saving us during this crisis at the same time, whereas the physical situation is so intense and so desperate at the moment. When I joined 3 years ago, I used to present on an American Army concept called VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, as a world that we were in and that internationalization was in. At that time, I believed and still believe that international cooperation across borders is essential for research, for teaching, for understanding, and for solving global challenges. Of course, right now, I think an international network like the ACU is more important than ever. I have to point out we are not the largest organization in the world, but we partner with the International Association of Universities, which have about the same number as us, and the Association of Universities Francophonie. So between us, we do represent over 2,000 universities across the world. And of course, we are reimagining ourselves as virtual networks currently. One of the positives out of this is that universities have had to adapt much more quickly to the online environment, and we're all learning as we're going. But of course, that means that in the next decade of students will hopefully benefit from that. Because one of the things I wanted to talk about was the difference between, say, marketization and massification. So the massification of higher education is an essential. We all believe here, and I think that that higher education is part of nation building, and that there is a massive gap between supply and demand, particularly within the global south and with our African members. And the marketization, which in some cases has resulted in the marketization of student markets, for example, and international mobility based on wealth or scholarships, is only the tip of the iceberg, because only a very small percentage of those students are actually of students who need that kind of education will ever be able to do that kind of travel. And we've been experimenting over the years in a number of ways. And I think the ways that the ACU has been experimenting with funding partners, governments, and with our members in African countries is possibly the way forward. So one of those is a program which actually Adam Habib talked about in a Times Higher editorial a few weeks ago, promoting the idea of distance masters and split site PhDs as a way of building capacity and building partnerships, and meaning that talent does have the benefits of international collaboration and mobility without the kind of drain on resources from where they're going from and going to. So the Commonwealth Scholarship Commission since 2002 has had about nearly 3,000 of these distance masters, and the majority of the people studying them in African countries are also working in their own universities. So that's one classic example. I think another example is a program we're doing with 20 universities in East Africa. It's called Pebble, and it's creating content with 7 African partners and the University of Edinburgh and a couple of other partners, looking at creating fantastically good quality modules, training trainers to deliver online. And over 17,000 students have so far benefited from that. Now, Pebble is, to me, an obvious example of how rather than MOOCs, which was perhaps an imperial model of piping content from one place and assuming it will cover the world's needs. Pebble is an example of collaboration, a regional collaboration, co-creating content that has a real ability to be scaled up and therefore answer some of the needs of meeting supply and demand, and particularly in a COVID context has real potential to grow. And then again, working with our South African members on research capacity building. I've been working with Eldo. We launched with the NRF last year, Generating Talent, which was about working with our members to create support for early career researchers. Actually, what Max was saying about the research culture is of a huge worry to us. We're worried about, for example, the experience of postgraduates not being able to travel to conferences, for example. We have networks across the ACU, and again, the benefit of an international collaboration is we learn from each other, we co-create content, and our peace and reconciliation, our climate and resilience, and our SDG networks have really relevant learning for this current period that we're in, that we're sharing through content and virtual meetings. But for example, we were doing a conference with Stellenbosch in June on addressing historical trauma and the role of arts in addressing historical trauma. That will be online, and we're trying to come up with partners with the most innovative ways that we can support young researchers to have a kind of conference experience and a networking experience, which is so vital in those early years, without actually physically traveling from one place to another. I mean, this is not going to last forever, but during this period, I think there will also be, I'm being the green shoots here, that there will be ways of working that will become the new normal, as well as some traditional mobility coming back.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joanna. To move to our next speaker, Professor Olunisakin, from your perspective as Vice President of King's College London and also as founder of the Africa Leadership Centre, I mean, will this potentially transform the nature of the work that King's and other, highly ranked Western institutions are doing with African universities? Max suggests that there'll be, a bit more of a brain drain, but Joanna's perhaps saying that there's more opportunities for researchers to stay in country or in region. What's your view?
No, I think this is uncharted territory, but I think it will create opportunities. Number one, it will test the quality of engagement of European, UK and European universities with their African partners. So let's separate what the ACU does. It's a large network, and actually it helps mitigate some of the risks of unequal partnership most of the time. So I think what Joanna says will continue. The challenge for those of us that on the one hand will count ourselves as world-class universities, and on the other hand, wants to see ourselves as building bridges and partnerships with the African continent, is that we now have to get real about it. There are two particular areas that I want to underscore. If you look at what Joanna talked about concerning the Pebbles project, there are not many situations like this. You can count how many of these world-class universities have joint degree programs with African universities. Very few. You have a number across Europe and so on, but protecting the rankings whilst doing business with African universities, those don't go hand in hand. I think protecting the rankings will have to shift to the SDG question you're talking about and the impact of universities in a different way. But we have to put our money where our mouth is when it comes to developing equal capacity with the African region. Where education is concerned, I think the co-creation, it can't happen soon enough, and happening online and virtually is where things are going. We at King's had spent some time. This is a British Council-funded initiative on with China on BRI. You're beginning to see for the first time situations where junior academics across more than 5 African universities are co-creating not just academic programs, but they're also working and practicing to work on the same platform. And this is designed to be over a few years in a row, so that you have academics, junior academics in China, in the UK, across 5 to 7 African countries, including University of Pretoria, where Professor Kope's institution and us have a joint PhD program. It has to be truly joint in its quality. And if we're going to do this with other degree programs, it has to be truly joint. And we have to bring the capacity, we have to bring to bear the capacity of the next generation of academics to develop quality programs in their countries. But it means, therefore, that what we call exchange, student exchange programs will look different. If a student is in Pretoria and my students are in Pretoria, they should be able to sit on the same program and get the same, and I should be confident that they would earn the same degree and of the same quality. This is where we will move to, because technology will enable that, but it also means that we have to be able to share our platforms as far as technology is concerned with those institutions. One last point, and that's about the inequality of education, not just between global North and South, is the uneven access and uneven quality between, say, if you like, South Africa and a handful of other African countries and the other universities on the continent. So I think we're going to have to see a degree of differentiation in the way that we work, such that we benefit the whole of the continent. We might be asking more of the Arua universities that Pretoria and a number of South African universities are a part of, along with Ghana, Uganda and co, Makerere and co, to do more for the rest of the continent. I think the time has come, and coronavirus has sped up, in a sense, that conversation for us to talk about truly equal quality of education. Research, comparative research will be driven by coronavirus, and I already see that happening. Thank you.
Dr. Strobel, I was asking, I mean, your role is Director of Strategic Partnerships for the South African National Research Foundation. So how significantly do you and your colleagues feel that this pandemic is going to disrupt your strategies?
Tim, thank you, and greetings to everyone online. Yes, the National Research Foundation is similar to those that are online, the Swiss National Science Foundation, UKRI, etc. We engage with universities as main clients, but in many cases with national facilities, cross-border research, a number of Africa networks, including Arua that Funmi has mentioned, the Science Granting Council's initiative, which is the sister organizations of the NRF on the continent, etc. And of course, globally through the Global Research Council. There's a stark reality, colleagues, if one thinks of the perspective of a funder. Ours is small in comparison with yours, but at any given time, we support 13,000 students, graduate students, 4,800 grants, both nationally, internationally, very much so on the African continent. And for many universities, the funding from a National Research Foundation, in our case specifically, is a significant part of the research funding available to continue with work. There's many students abroad that falls under the ambit of the universities, but of a Science Granting Council, and critical cross-border research is ongoing. With respect to national facilities or national laboratories, in many cases, there's critical experiments going on, production of medical isotopes, Earth observation, time-bound and time-sensitive research. So from that perspective, and as a national funder, there's many challenges that's currently under the ambit of this crisis that we've been seeing. What is needed, and certainly this has been high on the discussion or agenda for the past number of years, but brought into stark reality with the current crisis, is that there's been an increasing concern of the scientific community that research funding processes has become too conservative. And also, Max, you referred to this, in many cases, encourage only incremental advances in science and technology. So that we've seen that there's been a number of calls for a change in funding processes. And again, the current crisis has brought this forward to support high risk, high reward research. However, it's not just a question of funding. Many of our councils, in collaboration with the universities, look at the broader picture beyond funding, but at the research system level. issues such as disciplinary and institutional structures, research careers. Funmi, you've mentioned this, and the precarity of that, cultural norms in the science community, research evaluation, etc., all have an impact on the type of research that is being conducted. So certainly, as we've seen many of the calls, our own included, we work closely currently with UKRI, the Canadian IDRC, Swiss National Science Foundation, in the so-called call for rapid response research. This focuses our efforts, but it can marginalize the broader research environment. And again, Max, this links to you. Many of the science funders have extended the grant periods, increased current grant available for focusing on many of the disciplines linked to the current virus. However, we've seen, and especially in the African context, there's a majority of lack of preparedness for crises like these. And in many cases, it is as a result of decades long of underinvestment, both in terms of institutional reform and institutional capacity, but certainly also to be able to respond rapidly and look at those. The core capacities of many institutions, as Funmi has mentioned, certainly has been eroded. One of the advantages, and we say advantages in big quotation marks, of the current crisis is, as Johanna has referred, that we network more than ever before. It is extremely important currently. The notion of science diplomacy has really come to the fore. It has brought forward also discussions of the sometimes the inertia that one sees in collaboration because it's bound to funding structures or institutional structures. The notion of multidisciplinary research, as Professor Coupe has referred to, certainly is the focus of our current approach and focus in the type of research that needs to be supported. But the type of funding and the dedication and focus of that certainly needs to be commensurate. A last point is the role that universities play and the type of support that usually is necessary from science councils to make this happen in terms of science advice, the legitimacy and truth of science, the advice or recommendations to government. In our own case, we're part of the Government Technical Advisory Committee, and the NRF is coordinating a major component of that type of scientific advice to that. But it brings again into reality the unpreparedness of many of the institutions, but also the advantage of forcing, if you will, this type of uptake or understanding that is required and the advice that must be provided.
Thank you very much, Aldo. I think I'd quite like it if you could perhaps respond to Max's point, where he mentioned around funding becoming more political. I mean, is it possible for funding to be even more political? I wonder what you and other panelists think about that.
Tim, thank you. Yes, and trust Max to ask the pointed question. Look, let's be very realistic. What is politics when it comes to funding? From a funder's perspective, my own environment, we're a national funder using public funding to support and advance competitiveness, improve quality of life, etc. Increasingly, and there's numerous examples of how we work internationally, and in this notion of co-creation, as Funmi has mentioned, which is a very critical aspect of the notion of mission research or global challenge research, where we work together to do that. If one speaks, Mac, of politicizing the funding, that certainly, I think, can be the case internally or nationally, if you will, because you invariably see a competition among departments or the role that the science funder for basic research or applied research must play, and that certainly can hamper. But I don't view it as overly political, if you will, from the international perspective, because science is inherently international, or should be, one should say. And that conflagration of collaboration now, networks as important as ever, as Johanna has indicated, that tries to bring the notion of science diplomacy in terms of our collaborative shared need to the fore. That will make it important and hopefully depoliticize the notion of what science should do or could do, and truly work cross-border to bring our common impact, or what we're trying to achieve, common objectives to the fore.
Thank you. Can I invite others?
If I may. So I think that the interesting points have been raised here, but there's two extremes that we have to avoid. One, a narrow, insular kind of focused research done by academics without an understanding of the broader context of society. Research has to have quality and excellence in its own right, peer-reviewed, but we also have to think of 2-3 other steps, how that research translates into particular outcomes that deal with complex global and national challenges. And we're in that moment right now. I think that universities also need to reflect on that. The question is not that you shouldn't do the research that you want to do, that how are university research agendas aligned to the broader complex national challenges. And the administrative research, where it is directed for very narrow instrumental factors that really do not produce, and there is what is often called challenge-led research. What are the global challenges that face society today, and what are the answers that can come from institutions? So Joanna, Fumi, and even Aldo and Max have mentioned number of research alliances, collaborations, and partnerships that seek to respond by producing knowledge that is impactful and transform societies. That they define important. So what Aldo is saying is strengthening national research councils and funding them adequately. On the African continent, this has not happened, and it cannot simply be replaced by funding councils from everywhere. There should be, if you like, a complementary collaborative approach where you're putting money towards very specific research goals that are both national, regional, and as well as global. That is where the SDGs provide a very interesting framework. The 17 challenges, I think they present a beginning, the challenges that face the world, if you like, particularly the global south, if you like. And then also we should ask the big questions from a global and a national point of view. How to seek to fund this, and how do we, as Fumi was saying, begin to grow the next generation of researchers? Because this challenge is not challenges. After COVID-19,
I'm sorry.
Institutionally, but they should not come if you like produce ethics.
Excuse me, Tawana, but we've got some sound issues, I'm afraid, with your connection. So unless there are other colleagues who want to make another comment on this. Joanna, you're raising your hand.
I want to make a comment, not necessarily on the politicization of research, although I think it is about politicization of research in the sense of how research is rewarded and how people's careers in universities are rewarded. And that goes back to Anna's point about the usefulness of the SDGs as a framework, perhaps, but also that there is a tension that is being recognized and needs to be recognized, I think, in the Times Higher New SDG rankings as well, and was certainly discussed at the forum in Doha, where I remember very well a participant from a leading research university in China talking about the tension she feels between the reward and recognition of her career being in publishing in high-profile journals and the wish to do more research on immediate concerns in drought-ridden villages, for example, in China, where working with the villagers, you would come up with more with quicker solutions, which reminds me of the Circle project that the ACU is doing, working with climate scientists, where we're supporting the climate scientists themselves to further their careers, but we're also working with their research institutions to strengthen them at the same time. And the kinds of work that those Circle scientists have been doing have been practical applied research, like, for example, devices that can be given to farmers that give early warning signs of impending weather disasters that are going to happen and ravish their crops. So I'm saying that I think in some ways there is a political landscape which has to recognize the balance between applied research, the importance of retaining blue sky research, but also the importance of applied research, and that reward and recognition should come from recognizing a university's role as a third plank of society, if you like, and the kinds of partnerships that universities can have with third parties that can create real change quite quickly, as we're actually seeing immediately in universities' response across Africa and other countries in terms of how they're responding to the COVID pandemic now.
Can I add something to that very quickly?
Yeah, of course.
I think I agree that tension is there. The reality, though, and I'm not even sure whether it's a question of politics or the existential threat, or dealing with the existential threat that will face a number of universities as a result of this virus. And therefore, the implications for funding. Who do you fund? Do you fund, even at this moment, UK universities who might be struggling with recruitment of students? Do you give them more resources to do research and hope that they will do research in precisely the kinds of ways that Tawana and Joanna have just described? Or do you extend that funding to the developing world, to Africa at this moment? There's a real dilemma there. And I think that's where NRF, UKRI, all of the academic funding bodies have to really think carefully, working with ACU and others, as to how to manage this tension. Because the reality is, if we move outside of that funding environment and we go to what government support in other ways, and we go to what philanthropies do, the likelihood that they might respond to the immediate needs of the current environment. Look at what's going on in New York already with funding agencies and so on. I think that's where we have to manage this conversation carefully, so that we're all responding collectively and collaborating effectively in responding to these global challenges, of which coronavirus is a part.
Thank you.
This is Aldo. May I bring a short response? I know you will probably want to move on. I cannot agree more with Funmi's sentiments, and not speaking for the world of science funding, but this is certainly from the perspective of the Global Research Council, which is the virtual network of all the public funders in the world with a rather formal engagement. Some of the very critical aspects that are high on the agenda are currently being discussed. One must not lose sight of the fact that there's a very large differentiation in socioeconomic need on the one hand, and the type of research required for that. And on the other hand, the type of funding available and the type of investment scenario in that science ecosystem that is required. And Tawana touched on this briefly. Science funders, by and large, are publicly funded. So, of course, there's engagement with other philanthropies and development partners, etc. But the core funding of that public research is from the public purse, and it's channeled or facilitated, steer-directed by the science councils. That loops back to the notion of where is the need and where the focus should be. One cannot argue the fundamental importance of basic research as advantage to global development. But again, the need and especially economic differentiation of what one would like to see emanate from so-called applied research, that will stay an agenda item for a long time to discuss, because the need sometimes overpower this notion of what we discover and the long-term impact only, or hopefully that long-term impact that one will have to make it useful. Secondly, colleagues, let's be very frank also. We're discussing aspects of higher education development, cross-border funding, etc., that we would have discussed anyway outside of the current crisis. I'm pleased that this crisis assists us to focus in how we do this, how we collaborate to be effective, and continue with asking the critical questions. But we cannot waste for every crisis to try and make a step change in what the impact is we would like to see, both in terms of our institutional, government, regional type of perspectives, but certainly on what we would like to see is the impact on people's lives of this notion of science. How do we legitimize it? How is it understood? And how does everyone participate? So it's fortuitous, and again, in big quotation marks, that this forces us to focus our discussion. But let's not lose sight of the fact that these are perpetual questions that I do trust with our networks, with AACU, for instance, who is so influential, so well networked, that we can take that step, finally, I almost want to say, in terms of bringing the changes that are necessary and critical.
Thank you, Aldo. So do our panel, and I wonder if Joanna or Max want to comment first, in terms of, there is obviously a finite amount of resource, but potentially, much more resource coming for certain areas of applied research, or maybe for, investment in internationalization programs. I mean, how do you foresee the money growing? Do you foresee more philanthropy being available, for example? I mean, what's as if people are more positive about the value and the impact of research universities in certain areas, particularly connected to public health, do you think that it's going to be easier to redirect certain income streams or revenue?
I think, go ahead, John.
No, you go first.
I do think it's not going to be more or less across universities or countries or continents. I'm actually quite struck by at least the issues that have actually existed before the Corona crisis. I mean, in many ways, what we're seeing now, I think at all universities that I know, whether it's in Sub-Saharan Africa or Asia or Europe that I'm familiar with, I think these problems were already there. It's just there is on the one hand, I think this crisis is a catalyst and it's creating unpredictable effects. So whether or not blue sky research will get more or less funding is almost impossible to predict. I do believe, however, that universities before the crisis have already been in this force field between economic, political, as well as societal or sociocultural tensions, where it has been, maybe with the exception of some sectors of the humanities and some sections of the natural sciences, there has been an increasing demand for researchers to justify themselves. So I think that has happened already in the last few years, and I think we're going to see this a lot more. I'm actually a bit worried about philanthropists and endowments because there are very, very few who actually do not impose a certain influence. And Aldo emphasized, and I know that the National Research Foundation South Africa is quite amazing in its outlook, its broad horizon, and its ideology. But that cannot necessarily be said about other funding bodies. And I do believe that it's also universities who need to pick and who's the next professor they're going to appoint. And this has become much more of a political and an economic calculus, and not necessarily an intellectual or other kind of calculus. So it starts with appointments or promotions. It goes into what kind of grants. The bigger the grants, I mean, we in Switzerland have funding instruments that go in the tens of millions, and the bigger the funding, the more politicized, and the more people want to say, well, how much money is that going to create? So University of Basel is in a very good position because this is a pharma and life science oriented university. So for now, this crisis is going to probably play out well for the university. It's not going to play well for people like me because we are not considered in the core interest area. And I think this calculation is very interesting how that actually plays out.
Perhaps
Not in kind, but in kind, but not in degree, but in kind in many other universities.
Perhaps, Tawana, would you like to respond as a vice-chancellor yourself? How might this affect, your strategies in future research appointments and professorships, etc.?
It could have a very negative effect. But also, I think that the way we have positioned it at the University of Pretoria, and I think for me, reference some of it, is that what we as a university determine a research agenda that asks the big questions about what are the challenges of South Africa, the continent, and the world. And we package it in ways which, if you like, 3 products: standard academic products, referee journal articles with high citations, but also related intellectual projects that can be translated into policy and decision-making, evidence-based policy-making, as well as monitoring and evaluation. And also add a dimension to what the university does: social engagement that is based on its own teaching and research. In other words, we're embedding the university into society as a transformative agent which uses knowledge to transform society. That mitigates, if you like, against narrow political agendas for people with a 5-year electoral agenda. Because for them, in 5 years, they have to put up themselves for election. So it is so very easy for them to try and commandeer even knowledge institutions to save their narrow political agenda. But I think it's up to the university to be an astute political knowledge actor and also to understand that kind of behavior, but to feed it with the kind of products, if you like, or the intellectual forms of knowledge that, while saving their interests, also saves the long-term interests of society and the world. Because I think we have to agree that the university will not be insulated from political dynamics, but should rather actually seek to position itself using knowledge to influence political dynamics going forward. Sense the trends, sense the global challenges, speak to society, produce impact and relevance, but stick very much with that knowledge is sacrosanct in the way in which it is actually produced. You can't just manipulate it for short-term goals. So there will always be that, if you like, that jostling, that dynamic between knowledge institutions and political institutions more broadly, and even philanthropists, as well as those who are seeking to make out of knowledge narrow commercial gains.
Thank you very much, Tawana. And Joanna, I know you wanted to make a point around this, and particularly, for example, the scholarships that the ACU manage and the funding that you attract from different donors. How do you see that potentially changing?
I don't think I do. I think I've been listening and I'm not sure if I do. I think the dynamic, I think universities are mixed economies. They're huge communities of scholars and researchers, and at their very foundation, they believe in curiosity-led teaching and curiosity-led research, and those two and all the autonomy of institutions to determine their priorities. Now, they have to listen to external forces. They have to listen to government concerns and priorities, and they have to listen to community and society challenges, because if they don't, they're not going to be successful institutions. And I think so with those principles in place, I think it's important that that curiosity-based learning and research is the foundation of any approach towards funding opportunities. And I think that's, and don't forget sort of the excitement of the human imagination. When people do collaborate and get together and have ideas, and those ideas then grow into either applied or potentially other kinds of research. In terms of our donor funding for scholarships, they are very much to do with government priorities. So, for example, the UK funding of Chevening and Commonwealth scholars are about the funding of that is taken from the overseas development aid budget, which means that there are very strong levers in place to ensure that the scholars not only are brilliant, but they are also going to return and contribute to the countries that they come from. And with the Commonwealth Scholarship Commission in particular, there are now, as I mentioned in my introduction, really strong drivers to experiment with distance learning masters and with split site PhDs. And personally, as I also said, I think it's a really important direction of travel, in that international mobility and collaboration should always be a part of internationalization, but not because of need. It shouldn't be that people are traveling because they have to get an education somewhere else. We're really interested in building up the capacity of our universities across our networks to have strong curricula, to have strong opportunities for students, so that it's a choice to go and spend time at another university. And it's actually going to benefit both the university that student is going to and the university the student is going from.
Thank you, Joanna. I've as you promised at the beginning of this webinar, that we would take questions from our attendees, which we've got several hundred, I can see, watching now and asking lots of questions. So in the remaining sort of half hour that we have, please let's just try and take on a few. So the first question that came in actually follows really on from what you were talking about, Joanna, a bit. It's a question that says, what does the panel think about international student flows, and how might the global economic crisis on the back of this affect the willingness and means for students to study abroad? And then naturally, if there's an expected shortage of overseas students, how will African universities cope with the drop in the financial income? Would anyone like to reflect on that?
No, at the best of times, many African universities have been in precarious financial situations. And also they haven't been able to, if you like, get the kind of two-way international flow, even two ways, not a multi-flow flow of students. There's a tendency to have year abroad programs from the north, but no African students going from the south to the north, if you like, and because they cannot afford it. So you have to create that kind of economy, because what then ends up happening is people who go on their own steam, but those are not part of intellectual we're discussing today. If we focus a little bit, I think show the need for international exchanges and global flow of academic knowledge, capital, if like, and people. Because these global problems cannot be solved by single nations, and knowledge typically should not know any borders. So I think there is an opportunity to rethink internationalization, to re-embed mutuality and benefit, and so to find more creative ways of funding those. So for example, at my institution, we've often funded students going to the north through some of the fees that we get from people who come on their abroad programs. But what should really happen is that partners should sit around together and say, given our different mutual resourcing, how could we actually package a number of students to actually go either way? Last year, for example, I had a very interesting discussion with Father McShane at Fordham in New York, where we have some degree of collaboration and exchange of students in expanding the number of students both ways. And also there are benefits to global engagement and internationalization. They are little understood now, but more and more with such global challenges that require that we know each other, we network together. So I think even in these hard times, there are opportunities where we actually have to think out of the immediate crisis and think of the long term.
Thank you, Tawana. Funmi, I mean, King's has an enormous, global student body. What do you and your colleagues sort of think about, particularly if there's a collapse in the middle class in emerging economies? What's your view? Are you foreseeing a big drop?
Yes and no. And I have to say that, I mean, I don't know what the situation is with some of our other partner institutions. If we were having this conversation 5 years before now, we would be in a place of worry. And I know Joanna managed some of the transitions into where we are at this moment. And so technologically, the game changer is going to be technology, but the second game changer is going to be the culture of working. I have to say that many of our global north institutions have not been culturally competent before now. We have been learning that for the past few years. And so therefore the inequality that I think Tawana talked about mutuality. And we have layers of inequality in the way that internationalization is done. Unfortunately, many institutions see the flow of international students in a commercial way, and that is likely to end in the next era. Was it Aldo? Was it Max? I was talking about life after coronavirus. Life after coronavirus, because we're going to spend at least 8 to 9 months working our way through another way of working, through virtual learning, if you like, through online. I'm distinguishing between the two, and all sorts of blended formulas over the next few months. What it means is that we have to carefully look at the patterns of inequality that have occurred between Europe or global North and Africa in terms of student flows. Tawana is right. When you look at most of our universities, the students that come to us can afford, mostly middle, upper class students can afford to pay the fees that we have at the moment. When you think about exchanges and scholarships, they're few and far between. Now, I think we have to find a situation where more and more, it's not just a split campus. Split campus is fine, but when you're talking about the kind of education at undergraduate as postgraduate, doing this together with institutions and finding another pricing point. And at King's, we've been working this journey for some time. I talked to you about the BRI project we've been working on. Belt and Road Initiative is what I mean, so that all of that joint program development means that if the quality is right, you teach it together online and virtually and face-to-face where you need to, but it will mean that we have to come to a pricing point somewhere in the near future with our partners if we're going to truly offer quality education together. But I don't have a proposition for this, but I also see that within Africa itself, there's still another form of internationalization in which the top 6 universities or the top 7, I think if South Africa has the top 6 certainly, we'll see students coming who can afford it, coming from the global north for their summer, for other programs, study abroad, but they're not flowing into other African countries. You find a flow from other African countries into South Africa. This says something about the quality, and these are the things that we have to address. King's is only midpoint towards this because we are accepting the fact that we will not be able to teach face-to-face as normal. We have the technology and in a state of readiness. We've been in a state of readiness for the past year to begin to deliver virtually, but it is, what do you deliver? So the distinctiveness of what you're delivering as we're all moving into this space is what it's about. That distinctiveness has to be seen in who you're working with on the other side. Are we talking to students who themselves are well-grounded in their own sociocultural context and global cultures in particular ways? Are we also bringing opportunities that allows them to thrive in any context, virtually and in their own socioeconomic context or in the global arena? Are we bringing the kinds of media, and by media, a whole range of channels, not just what you do with technology, but ways of being, ways of engaging into the way we teach, because virtual and and online cannot be the only thing that you rely on through technology. You have to be able to transform people through all of that. And I think that's what will separate us from others in this next period. King's is working towards that. And we have been working towards it for the past few years. The transition from Joanna to myself and this particular period has put us, I think, in a good space. But still, if we are saying we will not be commercial about it, we're lying, because all our partners are not thinking about all these values we're talking about. They're busy being in the market. And so we have to really balance that tension.
And I actually have a question just to follow, as you mentioned media and Time for Higher Education. Obviously, we're a media organization. Yes. I mean, everybody is now accessing the world online. Africa itself, is very, very well networked. There's been a huge rise in smart devices.
Yes.
We've heard that there's increased respect or a value of research. But what about misinformation? I mean, is that a big danger, particularly in an African context? What's your thoughts, Funmi, particularly as your background in peace and conflict, and other panelists as well, around the danger of misinformation? Can that be managed?
Absolutely. I don't think it will vanish. It's going to be the differentiator. Even on coronavirus, as we've seen, there's a lot of misinformation, or in various African contexts as well as here, where all the myths surrounding what you can do to be cured immediately or not to, not to contract coronavirus, that has been confusing things. The thing with online and virtual and this media aspect is what will separate us in the end as quality universities and those that are struggling to provide quality education, is the carefulness with which the content is so crucial. The carefulness with which we bring evidence to bear through that virtual education, but also that the care that we take to ensure that the student community we're bringing into that space understands that content and they can deal with it scientifically. This is where, because we all now have the capacity one way or the other to be online, and Tawana was speaking to this at the start. What are we doing exactly when we're online? How are we translating evidence and bringing those students into the science of knowledge? I think that's what we have not sorted out on an equal basis. And this is the next test. The next 9 months will say a lot about what we have.
Aldo.
Could I say something about excellence and universities from a teaching perspective?
Yeah.
I think we're currently involuntarily going through at least a 2-semester experiment. And I think I would be extremely surprised if decision makers from whatever side they come from are not going to take a hard look at how well or certain things went, because in many ways, I mean, we are now used to speaking to a screen and to a camera. So it really doesn't matter if I speak to my Basel students or to my people who are, a few weeks ago, I've done a workshop in India on exactly the same computer, or if I have students from all over the world, including South Africa or Nigeria and so on. So it doesn't really matter where they're from. And then the next question that you could ask, and this goes in the direction of what Funmi said about excellence of an institution. Maybe it doesn't need to be me. Maybe it could be a Jeffrey Sachs, or maybe it could be a fantastic lecturer in South Africa. So I would be extremely surprised if people will not look at this one-year experiments, look at learning outcomes, and wonder to what extent we will actually need hundreds, if not thousands, of parallel courses that are covering extremely similar material all over the world. And I do think that this will have a huge impact on not only on teaching, but also on asking, well, what is excellence in learning and in teaching if we have gone through this one-year experience? Now, this is not necessarily my perspective, but I'm absolutely sure I will be confronted with these kinds of positions in the next couple of years. Why should students pay thousands, I mean, $50,000 a semester on course material that, first of all, they had to take online? And will there be some ambitious universities that say, well, we could do this across the globe for 1/10 of that price?
I agree. And therefore, the key question is, can you transform your students by teaching online with their values, their ways of knowing, their ways of being? Will those things are transformed by the time you finish teaching? And this is a question that we all have to face. I totally agree. We have to justify why someone has to pay all that money if all we're doing is regurgitating or just standing in front of the screen and teaching. Even if we're showing them there's some razzmatazz to what we're putting on slides, it's going to have to be much more than that. The student has to go away thinking that their lives change somewhat.
I have to come in here because I'm not sure I completely agree. No, I think that there's been the universities have been in general slow, far slower than their students to adapt to blended learning and online. And as we all know, students go into traditional institutions with smartphones, and the institutions don't have the wiring to be fully up and running for remote teaching. That was our reality a few years ago, where we were trying to catch up with our students' expectations and failing miserably. And there were lots of times pontificating, Times Higher articles and others in the media talking about what can we do about online learning and flipping the classroom, etc., etc. And this crisis is pushing us a little bit further into that experimentation. But I go back to this curiosity-led learning and teaching, and that universities are communities of scholars who have done exciting or are doing exciting work and thinking, and it's about communicating that work and thinking to their students. Now, I understand the context in universities where there is huge demand and lack of supply, and that's again where the ingenuity of online can actually come in and help. Our experience of Pebble, for example, where we have been creating really good content that can be taught in a blended way, means that you are changing and updating and decolonizing the curriculum in many places, and you are challenging your students to learn in different ways. But you are also, I think the principle that goes through that is that you are being taught by people who want to communicate knowledge and also want to question the students' own knowledge and ask them to co-contribute.
I'm sorry, let me come back on that. I don't disagree at all, but let's bring the African context into this. If we have a situation where the material that is coming from, so I think it might be a lot easier for us to do in some contexts than others. The material that is coming from another part of the world, and that's a key question for decolonizing the curriculum. Are people able to identify? Can they identify with the material they have when they look in their backyard, in their village, and so on, and the reality of those experiences? How are we making up for those things? Because sometimes the dialogue you have in the classroom in a face-to-face session can go on for some, so you're trying to bring student experiences to bear. But the moment you're online, unless we are truly reflective about how we deliver this, we could deliver broad materials, but testing it. The area of assessment online is going to be a game changer. We've been having that conversation about what we do with exams for now, and seeing the sorts of ideas that are emerging about how we do exams. Do we open it for 24 hours and so on? You can see where creativity lies in some, in some areas, but in other areas not. So these are some of the additions we have to reflect on very quickly.
I completely agree. Can I come back just very quickly, just on that point about co-creation, because I wanted to, I'm not suggesting that content should be piped from one part of the world to another at all.
I know.
The whole point of an international collaboration of networks like the ACU is that we co-create locally produced content, and we make sure that our local universities are actually part of the process of creating that content. So it's always relevant locally as well as in a broader way.
Can I please ask direct a question that perhaps Aldo would like to respond to? It's a question from Brenda Wingfield, which is, she says that much is what's being discussed about online teaching and knowledge transfer, but what about postgrad education in the biophysical sciences? It can't be done online, it needs to be laboratory based. Videos can't replace the laboratory. I mean, from an NRF perspective, I mean, how are you funding, or are you funding more online based education, or are you, what do you foresee for that problem?
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Brenda, a senior colleague at University of Pretoria, highly rated scientist. This combines with the discussion that we have just had, colleagues. I don't think we must overreact to this notion of only online or an and/or situation. It is critical, it is important. I think there's a major scope of how to expand this, not only because of the crisis, but obviously we are responding to this crisis. But from a postgraduate perspective, especially, I feel very strongly that you can never take away the physicality or the interactive part of international exposure, working in another environment, etc. The NRF actually is currently implementing, ironically, a very large global program of exposure of graduate students that will be mandatory for the foreseeable future of all the graduate students that the NRF funds. It's ambitious, it's a mega program, but we want to be purposeful in working towards that. And we are speaking to prominent partners like the ACU, etc. Now, if we speak of modern technology or engagement based on Brenda's point of view, there's partnerships that we have with respect to virtual laboratories, for instance. The whole notion of open science with its constituent aspects of whatever is open. It shows that from an African perspective, at least, I don't think we are completely ready. We're working through many initiatives like the African Open Science Platform, other initiatives that we're linking with the other continents to bring this notion of openness, sharing, a virtual way of work, etc. But I am very strongly opposed, I think, to this notion that everything can be virtual, or that everything can be this notion of distance engagement. Think of the veterinary environment, for instance. As Brenda said, the biophysical sciences, they will always have to be a physicality to that. Please allow me, I cannot resist to make a remark on the previous question on this notion of misinformation. Tim, you specifically said, and especially in the African context. I think you are right, but let's not forget the notion of misinformation or the politicalness of whose virus this was or is, etc., which has been going on globally and in developed countries. I said initially with the opening remarks, it is quite fundamental to engage the role of universities in this notion of the publics that they speak to. It is governments, it is the person on the street, it is other funders, it's among themselves, etc. This will have to remain quite critical. And we cannot, even in this crisis or in general, the notion of science, the truth of it, the legitimacy of it, step away from the process. A last comment in terms of movements. There's interesting work that Simon Marginson, the director of the Center for Global Higher Education, has been doing, predicting that it will take 5 years for mobility to recover. I hope that that type of mobility or the profile of that knowledge ecosystem will be different. Again, back to Brenda's notion, we will have to engage. There will have to be a physicality in how we do research and how graduate students are educated. Secondly, we will see in English-speaking destination countries that are usually used to a supply-driven market, and they provide visas for whatever quota they provide. And this is back to Funmi's idea or comment on that, yes, it is a business, it is an industry. But we do foresee that there will be a major shift in that type of usual supply aspect to a demand engagement. There's been a rapidity in the recovery rate in East Asia, for instance. We foresee that there will be a larger conglomeration of Eastern Asian students staying among the countries of East Asia as so-called international researchers or international students, as opposed to fewer opting for the usual North America, Europe, UK, Australia, etc. So those would be my comments, colleagues, but I think there must be a matter of realism brought into this. Yes, we're responding to a crisis. Number two, many of the aspects are our standing aspects of challenges, of how to engage, of how to better educate, of how to better network or collaborate for impact. But we are spurred by an urgency where we are. So let's hope that this will make the uptake of the change much quicker than it has been going in general.
Thank you, Aldo. So we have about 10 minutes left of this section of today's programme. And thank you to everybody who's been writing in questions and comments. You know, we will be sharing everything via email after this session. And I also hope that, you know, we might be able to get some of our speakers to, perhaps if they have the time, respond a bit more fully if they wish to some of the questions. But I wanted to perhaps get your quick responses, if I may, to a question coming back to the tensions around reward systems for types of research. And obviously, Times Higher Education, we have our impact rankings, which are being published on the 22nd of April. We also have our well-established global research rankings. So and other rankings providers are available. So what role should global rankings play in changing this tension around reward systems? And how strongly do you think the impact rankings could change perceptions and incentives in favor of new types of applied research?
I think what should happen is that the impact rankings do something that's very important. In general, in research on teaching and scholarship, where we variously called social engagement or public engagement, some people call it relevance. But people blankets because they should keep on. It's actually looking at social conditions and using knowledge to address them. That should be factored into a general evaluation of academic performance, not just research. The tendency sometimes to over-valorize research has made certain distortions in the academic architecture, if you like. There should be a relationship between teaching, learning, research, and social engagement. And I think the impact rankings become a useful indicator, one of the useful indicators of evaluation, of a broad-based holistic evaluation in that environment, and not a single one. And I think that's very, very important to strike the right kinds of balances. At University of Pretoria, we like to say we teach inquiry-led learning. In other words, people learn not just to get information and knowledge, but also to begin to ask critical questions and to begin to develop as researchers. But also we ask them to think about the impact of their research and its relevance to multiple levels of context, local, regional, and global. I think that so away from narrow-rated evaluation systems that at the end of the day produces students who are citizens, socially sensitive, ethically sensitive, and can actually transform lives. And the institution also taking that particular kind of post. Allow me to throw in one last thing. In relation to fake news, misinformation, and fake science, we need actually now to talk about how we teach critical information and media literacy. My background is as a professor of media studies. And with online is structures and platforms, but that will not help people actually relate, select, understand, interpret, and use information if they have no critical literacies around information and media and how it actually works. How do you distinguish from something that is fake if you are not trained in critical information and media literacy? So that is now actually center stage, because there's so much information flowing from all kinds of sources, some of them very dubious.
Thank you very much, Professor Tawana Koop. Would anyone else like to reflect on the role of rankings in perhaps changing perceptions of applied research and university impact?
I think I see more and more researchers who are internationally judged as excellent, starting to actually reflect more critically on the work that they're expected to do. And so I'm absolutely sure that rankings will continue to play a very important role, but and you can probably also tell us how ranking companies have become, how the rankings themselves have become very complicated. Because in many ways, I mean, maybe historically we thought that, you know, a high impact journal was the thing that you would go for. And there certainly are many colleagues who do aim for that, and appointment commissions are still driven by that. But going back to the idea of the force field, where universities also need to see themselves more also as a contributor to societal issues, where funding is very much not only politicized, but very much connected to economics. I do think that many top researchers, research teams, or research institutions start to actually wonder what that impact should be. And I think as long as the ranking organizations follow this, for better or worse, follow this trend, as long rankings will be important. But once, for instance, a country says we cannot afford that kind of research because we have to do X or Y, then rankings may actually become less relevant.
Thank you, Max.
Can I add something to that
course,
quickly, Tim? I think there's a lot of work to be done because I think things are shifting. And this impact rankings that you have, that's the marker. That's one of the markers that things are shifting. Because it's important for rankings to be able to tell us a lot that resonates with everyone in society about what is excellent knowledge and what is academically excellent knowledge that is relevant. And that threads through to Tawana's point. If we cannot be researchers that are looking at the world in a very critical way to bring the truth into the classroom where we teach, the truth about that world that we're investigating into the classroom where we teach, and in ways that will impact the larger society, whether through those students or through the other work that we're doing. If we cannot measure that in a way that resonates, we would lose the audience, and that's the society that we serve. And I think there's a lot for us to think about as universities going forward, and there's a lot for ranking institutions to think about. In the area of what qualifies as the most international universities, you can see how those elements, half of that spot on, because if you gauge us in terms of the collaboration we have across borders and the outputs of those, I can really see that. If we're only counting the numbers of students in the universities, but not how much a sense of belonging those students feel and how we are getting through to them to be culturally competent at home and abroad, wherever they are, then something is missing. And we just glorify rankings to say this is where we're located on the ranks. I think there's something to be done here.
Thank you. Maybe I'll let Aldo speak last. And Joanna, within your association, you've got some of the highest ranked universities in the world and also unranked universities. I mean, how does that affect the dynamic in your partnerships?
Well, I completely agree with Funmi about the fact that rankings can actually mask the real work that universities are doing. And of course, rankings also, particularly on international collaborations, are not based on hard metrics. Duncan might have some, but quite often, based on reputation, which is cohorts agreeing or disagreeing about how highly they think a university has performed. So I think rankings are very imperfect tools. I think it's always good to have data and analytics and to compare performances. And I think that's where, for example, the AIU has a confidential benchmarking exercise. So does the Association of Commonwealth Universities, where we help our universities compare data against each other to learn and improve from each other. The problem is that rankings is what pushes student choice and parental choice, perhaps particularly, and favors, unfortunately, richer universities always over the poorer ones. And even with the SDG rankings, which is moving towards a more applied definition of what universities do and their role in society, I suspect that they're missing out a lot of ACU member universities that are doing brilliant work, for example, in teaching-led universities, but do not have the resource within the university to provide the data to ranking the organizations that can then use that data to promote the university, because they are also very much a promotion tool as well as being useful metrics.
Thank you. And Aldo, in your role with the NRF, I mean, what's the NRF's take on the value and the position of rankings?
Tim, there's the old adage with those that are ranked, they like it, and those that are not ranked are full of criticism about the process. I cannot agree more with the sentiments that Johanna and Funmi has given. From a funder's perspective, I mean, the base of choice of differentiation is the type of research that is being done. So through a peer review mechanism, the quality is chosen. It would be biased to say that some research is better than others because that research is linked to a more highly ranked university than the other. So that certainly does not play a role. But let's be very realistic also. From my own perspective as an academic, but then also for where I work, a public funder of research, it will remain an important differentiator, not differentiated between who is better or not, but for the current metrics that is used by the rank cause, THE is one of them. I think there can be much more nuancing and inclusivity, but the notion of research focus, the quality of that, to me, that will remain an important differentiator. There has been nuancing or pragmatism in different ranking systems. So you have a BRICS ranking now. There's for those on the African continent. There's disciplinary rankings, etc. And surely many more universities can try then see themselves, or at least use the metrics to improve or to compete. But it would be unfair to say, even though the current list of metrics and the ranking systems and so is somewhat unfair, if you will, it is an important differentiator, competitiveness, quality approaches, etc. Looping back to what Funmi has said, yes, there's major gaps in how one can make this a much more complete tool to determine quality, to compete, etc. In South Africa, for instance, from an internal perspective, we also spoke about the advantages or quality of people participating. What one would like to see a much more equality-driven higher education system that goes for the same argument in other parts of the world. But let us be also insightful in how it is used. If you are highly ranked and you criticize the process, it kind of is a one-sided argument. Let's be engaged then with those that rank, with influencing the metrics, and move on from the current discussion that we're having on rankings, which is a little old, actually, to be frank.
Thank you, Aldo. And your clock in the background has neatly chimed, as we have for the time that I promised we'll end this session. I mean, I think I would say just, from the beginning, Max said that it was impossible to make any predictions right now. So thank you all, firstly, for your courage in nevertheless trying to make some predictions about what's happening and what might happen. On a personal level, I actually feel quite enriched and positive about, the opportunities that you and your colleagues and your communities are all trying to take and develop to enable you to continue the amazing work that you're already doing, but also in particular to reduce certain, inequalities, educational injustice, and improve your cultural collaborations as well. I think that hopefully that can be a really positive outcome of this otherwise terrible pandemic and the impact that it's having on all of us around the world. I will say Duncan Ross, the Times Higher Education's Chief Data Officer, will be joining us in about 5 minutes, so he can start talking further about the impact ranking methodology and answer your questions. We're actually launching the impact rankings and publishing the data, the global data we have, on the 22nd of April, where we'll have a full online forum there. So please check with timeshighereducation.com of how you can all take part in that. And I'm very happy to say that we've been talking with Professor Tawana Koop and his colleagues about hosting the Southern African Impact Forum actually in the University of Pretoria. And we're hoping to do that on the 3rd and 4th of February. So I really hope, again, thank you so much for joining us online. Over 300 people have been watching this, but I hope we can see you all face to face in February. This is online. We can't all hear a round of applause, and I don't have that sound effect, sadly, but please join me in giving a private round of applause and great thanks to our distinguished panelists, Professor Tawana Koop, Professor Max Bergman, Dr. Joanna Newman, Professor Funmi Olonisikin, and Dr. Aldo Strobel. Thank you so much.